how do you explain what you went through, right? If I don't dance, I'm nothing. Even somebody dying, quite surreal. If you didn't see him die, you think he's still alive in some other aspect. What am I going to do, right? Am I going to die? What makes it existential is that it never heals. People think that, what if I'm possessed by something I don't want to come into me? If everything's so certain, you become quite uncomfortable. Everybody before you has taken this path, and every after you, including me, will take this path one day.
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today I am speaking with Tony Yap, an accomplished dancer and multidisciplinary artist who explores and creates an individual dance theatre language informed by psychophysical research, Asian shamanistic trance dance, Botu, and psycho-vocal experimentations. Thank you for being with us, Tony.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Tony, did I get that word correct? Buto?
Yes, Bhutto is correct. Yeah.
What is Buto?
Well, Bhutto started in the late 50s, early 60s in Japan. It's a dance form, like a lot of avant-garde dance forms around the world, that has a kind of a new movements against the traditional, like Martha Graham in the West. Bhutto in Japan was a post-war response, of a new kind of aesthetics against kabuki, and all the kind of traditional forms. So it has a kind of darker, freer element to the aesthetics, to the movement. And in Japan, it was influenced by German expressionists and thinkers of the theater like Antonin. So it's breaking out from a very ordered area into a kind of more darker psyche of the being. And so a lot of that was started at that time, and it went raw in the beginning, and then now it refined to new phases of it. But that was Bhutto, Butoh, started in Japan. But it does have a lot of similarities also of work, like Tarantella, Dionysian, or Hysteria. So these are all the kind of aesthetics around the world that's similar to Bhutto. But it's dance, and it is something that is, they call it dance of the dark side.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And how did you get started in dance, Tony?
I think dance is a very interesting thing to talk about, because when you think about dance, you think about social dancers, fun, you're going out there and lose yourself in some kind of a disco or the eras of rock and roll. So there are certain dance forms that I always like dancing. But I've never thought myself as a dancer because I wasn't trained. So I did fine arts. And then when this aesthetics I was telling you, late 50s, started, even in the West, talking about dance for non-dancers, gestures, and all the kind of aesthetics. Why does the body move? And then of course, later to my studies now, in reference to my background of trance and possession. And so, in some way, dance is what the body does in movement in relationship to why it needs to dance in a kind of art form. So now dance is, in my sense, it could be dance theater, it could be a, movement, physical theater. It could be a whole lot of situation. And you've seen my work. So in some way,
Yeah.
it is specifically between theater and dance, I suppose, if you have to put in the category. And it's all in the body. So it's minimal in the sense of, any kind of need for decorations or effects on the external. It is a psychophysicality. So you tend to feel or see the interior rather than a kind of ideas, kind of visual base. So the choreographic things could be more intense in that sense, yeah.
And to perhaps contextualize it for the people who are listening, I saw you perform as part of the Sydney Death and Dying Festival last year, and I was absolutely captivated by your performance. I found it so beautifully emotional, and it was very simple how it was just a spotlight on a stage on you. You danced within a rope that I believe, from memory, it was on the ground, and it was just a very simple stage for you to perform on. But I just could not take my eyes off you. And it was such an emotional, and it really was. I can see why it's that psychophysical aspect of embodying the emotion. And
Yeah.
so tell me, you started off in doing a fine arts degree.
Yes.
What was that in? Was that in theatre or performance or?
Well, the first one is fine arts, which is visual arts. So, I majored in printmaking, I did sculpture, I did the whole lot of what necessary into this. But then later, I became a graphic designer just as a way of making a living. And this is in the 70s. So,
Yeah.
it's very, when you draw, no AI already. But the shift to theater began when I started in Horsham with a contemporary art group, and performance art became quite known. So I shifted. My first performance was in 1982 or something. It was a big shift for me to suddenly realize my body had something very natural for me to express this deep sense of myself. And I'm still a visual artist. And so I did, after that, because of graphic design, I did an honors. And then later, I also finished a PhD focusing on this trance and physicality, this area of how it affects contemporary dancers and how it can help some kind of link between Eastern and Western dance aesthetics now, but not that it hasn't been happening. It has always been happening, but I think it's not often that you see a Eastern practitioner articulating it from the practice, from where they were born and practice. Usually it is a Western going to the East to study these methods, and then you read everything about the Eastern. And so I learned from the West, who learned from the East. And so I said, but this is a time I articulate it from the inside perspective. I think they call it emic and ethics. So emic is, from an inside perspective. So that is my contribution. And I feel it is an important one because there's a lot of things written. And as a practitioner, because I was brought up in a temple, in the background of where I was born, my house was a temple, and then people go into trance in this Taoist kind of setting, temple. So it is quite exotic and different from the Western perspective in the general middle sense. But to me, it was just an everyday thing, and for a lot of people in the East. So how does this intensity relate to contemporary practice now? Like, so a lot of people love it, and they maybe long for it after a whole lot of over-rationalized, over-reasoned forms of art. There is an area where it is intensity, it is actually cathartic, and it is visceral in the meaning. And that, I think, there is a big hunger for that. So that's my visual background to performance.
And can you tell me a little bit about your heritage? You say that you grew up with, a temple in your backyard. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what your heritage is, Tony.
Well, my mother was adopted. As I found out in my DNA, she had actually got the archipelago like Indonesia, right to Sulawesi, and also maybe about 15% of that is from her. She was adopted, and her father, my grandfather, was half Irish and half Sri Lankan. And my father's side was southern China in Hainan, so near Vietnam, and intermarried with the indigenous mountain people. So being all that, I'm basically more Chinese than anything in the kind of South Chinese, Indo-Chinese heritage. But culturally, my mother's adopted, parents were Christians. My father's side were Taoist Buddhists. And so when my mother married my father, it naturally became the practice of our family. But I went to a Christian school, a kind of a mission Christian school. And so I was converted to Christianity. And thus I adopted the name Anthony, Tony, is Christian name.
Yep.
And so these are the kind of change. But this is from the 50s to the 60s. So it's a different era as you're talking now. So the international sense of multiculturalism is quite different from those days. Those days, my mother didn't even have a birth certificate, so it's kind of a shift. So I have that cultural background, but religiously and even spiritually, it's animistic society. People believe in a lot of energy and spirit of place, what I call kind of psycho geography or genius loci or spirit of sacred space or sacred land. So all this kind of area in my practice come from that background. And even though I was a Buddhist, brought up Buddhist and Taoist, which sets the temple scene in my house, which is Taoist, and it has a lot of gods. So they're like archetypes of, I suppose, any archetypes of multiple gods, like the Greeks or the Hindus. Yeah, like our psyche, the goddess of mercy, and then the child, the innocent, and then the monkey, the animal, and then the effeminate, beggar. So these are all the gods in some ways, and then they are the classic gods of the warriors and the gods of war and gods of hell. And so there's many, I don't know how, I won't say hundreds, but there are many archetypes. So these gods, say once or twice a week, normal people in the villages will come, mostly Chinese in the area and in that phase, will come, and there will be a medium being possessed by one of his gods, and then they will consult. So it's this link between these two worlds of the living and a whole, I don't know what you call it. It is not, I mean, when I hear about the remedies, they're very sound advices. Sometimes, something like eat well, and don't fight with your neighbors, something, or be on good terms. And of course, that actually is well-being, like
Yeah.
being in good terms. So it gives them a kind of authority for a god or goddess or deity to tell them something they already know. That is my interpretation of it. And then sometimes people go with very clear, simple needs like money, like how am I going to survive, And then I suppose that itself is interesting. I mean, if I go further, I could see how when one fears less, there is more creativity. Usually fear itself, hinders the kind of possible anything that might happen, right?
So this was a regular occurrence in your
Yes.
community,
Yeah.
that it would happen once a week?
Once or twice a week, but it varies. Sometimes, once a month, and then a special occasion of a birthday of a god. And then they also have this kind of physical feats like walking on fire and cutting your back with an axe and things like that, or a ball of spikes. Always to remind you that these gods are kind of supernatural, which in the psychic sense we do anyway, we do super things when the necessity comes.
And so this was the environment that you grew up in, Tony?
Yeah. And not to mention that, like the school was a very rational place, and we tried to excel, and thus it was a very important time after the independence of Malaysia where they pushed a whole generation to study hard and to achieve, academic levels that they couldn't, our parents and our generation. So they were more practical mostly. But my father was learned. He was actually a detective. So he actually had the
Oh,
opportunity.
really?
Yes, so he had the opportunity to learn and to study and work for the 5 governments, including the British, Strait settlements, and then it goes on to Japanese occupation and the new government, the independence. So he worked under 5 different governments, and so it's interesting. All those are very interesting.
It's so interesting that what you're actually talking about, because there's obviously such a contrast between the community aspect and having these regular, community group experiences where you're talking about deities and spirituality, and then you're yet at the same time attending a Christian school, which has
Yes.
obviously got probably very different views at that particular point in time. But also, from what you're saying, just the amount of change in structure and of just a country such as Malaysia in such a short period of time. What you were saying, just what your father went through with just different regulations and governments and such turmoil. Do you think that has provided a really good platform for you to move into the work that you've moved into with your psychophysical research?
I think that multiplicity of things is rich, and it always should be. And every time when something's simple, I find it more difficult. Like singular, like saying that this is the right culture, and you can't understand that. You can't understand how one person can be right. When you have always exposed to multiple views, like multiplicity. And it's always a kind of cynicism I will have when somebody's so certain of something. Is it, how can you be so certain? Like, so that is a kind of base there, every times. And yeah, so it didn't make me think that life itself is so complicated and so varied all the time. I always link, like everybody else, in a very simple way of being human, like how you're saddened or you're angry or you have strives for something more or desires, and or the ego or the super ego wanting to have something better. It's just being human like that. But I travel easier if I have a wider sense of language and vocabulary. I think when I go back traveling around Southeast Asia, I feel very much at home everywhere. But I can say to some extent, I can communicate in the West, but I see a difference like in Europe, but I still feel very comfortable. I mean, but when you're traveling, you're comfortable anywhere. But when you have to live there, it might be different. So the sense of, like, even in the countryside, right? People say I can live there, but you can't. You can visit
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
So the sense is knowing oneself. I think it's more of the process of knowing this home body rather than these variations of things. So many things could happen in lifetime for sure, but we are going through tremendous thing right now, right? In a global sense, all the time. Even when the wall came down, every time something happens, when the Gaza start bombing, it's all so unfathomable when it happened until you see in retrospect. And I think historically, it has never quite changed. It always had that intensity. So maybe bringing our theme of death, it actually is a revelation to understand this kind of a transientness of things, like, and to a certain idea that death itself is just a kind of egoless moment where you don't have memories, you don't think, and you're just here. And often I don't think about all these things that people ask me, like, how do you explain what you went through, right? And vice versa. I'm sure everybody has a man's story of how they just be human, just to be born, right? So
Yeah.
different, yeah.
I am now also going to ask you that question. Was there one particular incident that happened in your life that made you go, look, I'm really going to focus on how my body carries my emotions, and then make that the focus of your practice?
Yeah. Well, I've been making my living in the visual arts, mostly as a graphic designer. So, like chief designer at Melbourne University, La Trobe, CSIRO, and then also working with the film festival for 7 years. But during all that time, something else was happening. So now it takes over. Now, my whole practice, my whole life is performance in that sense of multidisciplinary, multi collaborative levels. But different time you need to identify, I'm a graphic designer, I'm a dancer. Well, in the 80s, I did a lot of workshops and a lot of things happened in Melbourne, from New York, from Japan. So there's a lot of influences. One of the companies from Italy asked me to join them. And for 5 years, I became one of their theater principal actor. And we travel a lot. And this introduced me to psychophysicality and the kind of ideas from Artaud to Grotowski, which is, they're all in the area of physical theater. And how later, when I'm separated from this Italian company, I started to think, then where am I? Then I begin to study my own research and then my own company and my own method of dance workshops to understand the body. And it changes all the time as I get older. When I'm young, I could do incredible things like somersaults and stuff. But as you grow older, you know that there's a kind of interior intensity that's important. The physicality has limits.
And tell me about the company and how that got started and what makes it unique to your particular style that you've developed.
Yes. So when I joined this Italian company, it was mostly a lot of Greek tragedies they were putting on, and I was mostly the protagonist. And one of them was Medea, and suddenly I understood different ways of understanding how a man can play a woman's part, or how it can be a sense of being displaced, like Medea was from one land, like she's a priestess, to Athens, to a very rational place. So these are all crossover. Felt like I learned a lot from that company. And Renato Cuocolo was a director. And when they left, in a natural sense, quite complicated, then I was left with, what am I going to do, So I've been recognized as a theater practitioner everywhere, but I don't really get the kind of parts I get in this work. In Australia, I started to get parts, but I play very stereotype parts, like a Malaysian pearl diver and stuff. You won't find me playing, Hamlet in Shakespeare or something. But in the other kind of theater, I could, like, Peter Brook, they had a multi. So Europe is more advanced in that kind of research, or even though we are very close to Asia in Australia, but in many other ways, we are very English. And also, we do have very close Asian neighbors. And so the influence is different. So I think that I said, I'm going to give up performance and dance. But then my father died. So I did a last performance, and I wasn't recognized for my work much. And I said, this will be my last performance, called The Decay of the Angel. And then I will just immerse myself in graphic design and do well in that area. But then I was nominated for Male Dancer Award in the Green Room Award, and I won. So that kind of stopped me from saying not dancing. So I continued. And also it exposed me to a lot of people wanting to work with me in different ways. And so,
Because the Green Room Awards are the most prestigious award you can get in Australia for dance, is that right?
I don't know, sure about in Australia, but definitely from Victoria.
Yeah.
It's a Victorian thing. But then, Melbourne is the arts capital, so we can say
That's right, Tony. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we can do anything here, really. And that's one thing beautiful about Melbourne. It's an openness. Then I said I should start my own method of work and continue. And then with that, the obvious thing is to go back to where I come from, because people have been saying your performance is like ghostly and intensity is so different with like what you say, like when you see my performance. So where did that come from? It must come from where the temple scenes and the intensity of those mediums and trance work. So I dwelled into the research of trance work, and then I got little funding from Creative Victoria. Then Asia Link helped launch me into another stage, and then Australia Council gave me a dance fellowship. So it all accumulated, and then I decided to do my PhD in a very late stage of my life, so that I can, just harness and articulate all my life work. And so then came Animal God. That's actually the latest of my work, which I think it represents in terms of poor theater, minimal, where the body does everything, and it has all that language enough for theatrical experience for the audience, and open up into kind of psychophysical, emotional area for the audience, and perhaps cathartic in a sense. So it has a sense of unblocking something for the audience. And likewise, every time I perform that, it's like a loop. I get, when the audience is so focused, it's a loop. I become more focused, and it just, so it's quite interesting when I perform for the camera.
Could you tell us a little bit about how Animal God came about?
Yes. Well, Animal God, when I did the research on trance, I picked two areas because people have a certain idea of what trance is, but they don't understand. So, I gave them two perspectives of practice. One is a very high level culture, like the royalties from Jogja. So they are real royals, and it is a court dance. It's very refined, and they're always reflecting deities and gods and goddesses. And on the other end, it's very raw animal kind of work where the trance is very Dionysian and scary and very physical, intense. And that is the animal. Usually it's like, and in other kind of, which I like, the Gottori and Deleuze in A Thousand Plateau talks about becoming intense, becoming animal, becoming God. So I use that in a reference also to these two trance practices. So it gives you immediately an idea that trance is not just one thing. You can daydream, even children naturally go into trance, and they all have different function, and so I'm looking at a deep trance area, animal, and then a very refined, focus area, mesmerizing, and that part is what I mix. And you see these two elements in my performance, intense, and then you go into a very suspended space of mesmerizing thing, and then maybe that's the time when people open themselves, and sometimes people do cry. And so I work with this as my choreographic kind of notations. How do one dance if it's not just a physical kind of choreography? So it's an interior choreography. It's more complex. So the structuring of it make me think about these two elements, and I call it animal guard, because you have this internal and the external. You have this focus and control area, and then you have this, this kind of no control or losing control. You want to. So you have a safe space, and how you create that safe space, and how traditionally people do that, and how this can be interpreted into a contemporary arena. So you don't have to actually be like what this cultural practice is in Indonesia, in Java, or there, because we are not them, we are ourselves. But to understand where it comes from, it is the same. And we might have had that for a long time and lost it because we have become urbanized or whatever in different ways of focus. But definitely it opens us back into what readily available, one lacking maybe in one culture to the other. And this is a beautiful side. Yeah.
And Tony, when you're referring to the traditional roots of trance in those areas, how would they have been practiced? Would they have been everyday people, or would it have been religious people? Who would have used trance as a form?
I think in most kind of practices, in art practices, sometimes they say there's a kind of calling. So you recognize. Even here, you hear people say, if I don't dance, I'm nothing. So they know they're a dancer from the start, or a painter or a writer. So there's a kind of calling. And then there is, in the refined work of the palace, they learn from childhood all the gestures, and very precise, And from that very precise structure comes improvisation. So the idea of improvisation is different from the animal side, which actually anybody can go into. So it's a kind of authenticity, but they have a kind of physical base because it's very physical. So they start with martial arts. So there's a groundedness. And martial arts is a very good practice for a lot of young people anyway. It's a very healthy form, but it grounds them physically and also maybe psychologically, because they also have the system of respect.
Because it seems to me when you're explaining that it doesn't seem that you can really separate trance as a form of practice from being, it's a physical thing, but it seems like it has to be directly connected to where you are psychologically.
Yeah, but nonetheless, there are one society, like one end of the society is the lower rung economically, and the other one is a very high rung. And you can say whatever high and low means, or it doesn't matter. Like low is equal as high, then you see them as one entity of necessity, like the elements of negative and positive, or yin and yang. So this comes with the society. You cannot separate. So rulers have to rule, workers have to serve. So it just gives you an idea of how they practice. To give you an example, one of the interview I did for both elements, so the princess who I work with, and then the head of the bull trance I work with in the animal area, he says that the young people in that area had a kind of lethargic and no enthusiasm for life, and they take to drinks and drugs and become social problem. And so he reintroduced that from dreams and come situation, and he was brought into a very low part of his life also. And that is the moment when things change. Then he introduced this bull trance practice that was ancestrally there from his ancestors, But it was stopped by the colonists' power. And then so when then slowly he brought it back from dreams. And then it took momentum. And within 5 years, he had a lot of resistance, especially from the Islamic kind of area. Said this is not the right practice they want. Not all, because they assimilate into some link now. And now, so he said, the young people are full of energy, and enthusiasm for life. So they need this area of practice. They need this area. And I don't think that it's an area that you let out. Sometimes people say express and let out. I don't think so. I think it is a necessity to actually, it goes both ways. It needs an intensity, and the intensity is like the life force of life itself, like the bolt of lightning, which kind of what they use in the whip for the animal. But then when you go to the mesmeric high level of trance, like underneath is a lot of suffering and hard work as well. It's just two different languages. You want to give up so quickly because it's so tedious, and so, to actually carry on takes incredible inner strength. So you have this physical outer strength and inner strength, and you see animal god as one entity, really. So when I did the dance, it was actually accidental, because at the end of my PhD, I actually have this idea of a performance I wanted to do, but because of the lockdown, I couldn't do it. And then I heard the news from the composer Ezio Bosso, who wrote the music, just passed away. I had met him not too far away, and it felt like, this lockdown. And then I just put the music down like a little speaker, put his music, and then recorded. And then it went viral, even, and 70,000 viewers.
And this was in Abbotsford Convent, wasn't it? It was just nearby a window, and
Yeah, just on the wall, and I didn't move very much. So, it was like a square meter spot.
how was that for someone who has spent their entire life within the arts and perfecting their practice, and to find that you went viral for something that you just did off how you were feeling, so how to express yourself, and it wasn't, choreographed or wasn't really thought of that much in
Mm.
the lighting or anything like that, and it just went off. How was that?
It was surreal in the sense that I didn't know how you look at numbers and you can't understand it, because they can't all digital. It's different when somebody tells you live,
Mm.
and then you see the numbers flicking and you say, wow, what does that mean? So there's a lot of people writing to me. So it was quite interesting. That part was interesting. And usually it says this, they are the dancers, and the actors say, look how physical you can be and tell the story. And the dancers say, look how theatrical and dramatic a dancer can be. And so in these two disciplines, I see, and then it went viral around the Latin countries, like, it went to Italy and then to South America, but not to Asia. It was quite interesting. Like Asia is so used to it, okay, but also maybe the music was very Western. I mean, so the music was called, Unconditioned Following a Bird. And that was a very beautiful experience, because I didn't choreograph. I didn't prepare myself for the dance. The song was 6 minutes, 14 seconds, and that was it. I put the song on and I just let my body go. And I just remembered how a whole sense of psychological longing, emptiness, or this very sense of being locked down, and it's global, right? So it's quite powerful feeling, of somebody dying, and you do not know whether it's sad or not. It's just even somebody dying, quite surreal, because he was in Italy. It's like you didn't see him die, you think he's still alive in some other aspect. So when the music came in, it was a direct communication from the music to the body. And it's told me something that I never thought before, what was in the title. Because I think Axio wrote the music in the last stages of his life, when he had the tumor in the brain. And I can just imagine, what am I going to do, right? Am I going to die? And I'm going to do operation and not come out. And so this uncertainty of the last anesthetic, like maybe I won't wake up. So he did survive the first operation and stuff like that. And then he did perform quite miraculously after that because he could hardly move. But then when he played the piano, it was smooth. So the idea came to me when I was dancing the music, that it revealed to me that it's like a spirit, like the bird was a spirit that he was following. When he's so confused, he just let it go and just say, I'm going to follow you unconditionally. Like, it's like, but also the word unconditioned to me, knowing Axio is like, it is a word to mean love, because love is an unconditioned area. There's nothing can be conditional. A lot of people talk about falling out of love, which I never understood, because it's like a
Yep.
condition, like, and so it is that part that opens up something, and then the spirit of a bird. I could almost feel that I was following the same bird in the music. And so, like a musician, and I've danced with Axel before, he can take you to heights that you think you're flying. But then it takes so much out of you that you have to come down like Icarus, like I have to find this base back to humanity. And I think usually that coming down affects the audience. It feels like this amazing state, and then how to drop back into this little body of yours, So that itself is the language of ecstasy, is the language of, all that intensity of life and death. And euphoria, they kind of all beautiful qualities of what a theater should be, right? Or listen to music or any art form.
It's really beautiful because, in just over the 6 minutes, you managed to convey all of that so beautifully.
I felt I was just being empty, like something took over me. So I felt that at the moment, in any other situations, when I feel that I want to hang or I want to choreograph, I wouldn't have achieved that clarity. So it's not so much me dancing, it is something dancing through me. And all I have to do is to be empty. It's not hard to empty oneself, which is a metaphor for me for death. It's an departure from an ego state to empty oneself. Unless you're empty, something cannot take over, like a mediumship. And so there is a lot of reference that to life is that even in any religion, talking about surrendering your life, so to speak, your ego, so that God can be present. And that is an understanding. So it happened because the emotion was there. And I wouldn't say it's grief because it wasn't sad or anything. It was just a kind of shock. It's a kind of wonder, which, by the way, is what, when we're talking about the wound before the theme of the work and like nature before, it's a German word, come from a German Wund, wunderbar, which means wonderful. So the wound itself is a wonder, it's a place of something wonderful.
And that's a current work you're working on now, isn't it, Tony? Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it originated and how it's actually taking form?
Yes. I mean, I got a residency 2 weeks in Queenstown last year in Tasmania, and it is known for a place of mining, like a mining town, and also at one stage a big mining disaster. And it's one of the most exploited place in the world. like huge area just disappeared, like a big hole, and the river still bleeds. It's still orange from every time it rains, and they say it'll never heal. And I don't know how. And I mean, I can't comprehend that something doesn't heal. But then when you read about any kind of philosophical ideas of the wound, of the existential wound, what makes it existential is that it never heals. So this idea of suffering, this idea of being born, is already suffering. And so it's a beautiful idea of how one goes with the other side. The wound is wonderful, right? So physically it's beautiful. Psychologically, how do I move? How it affects my body? And emotionally, also historically, and I don't understand because of 2 weeks there, I see the local people and how it affects them. Different categories of people, not the artists, but just people walking around, and how their ancestors have lived there. And nowadays, there's still some mining going on, but it's very technical. We went in the tunnel and we drove 12 kilometers underground, like drove 12 kilometers
Wow.
under the water. So it's a fascinating kind of concept. But in those days, it's very narrow and where they can get gas and collapse and all that kind of area, which actually happened. And so how the museums still portray those psychological things, not to mention the wealth that came with it, you know. And then the railway line, and you can see the old buildings have a kind of a grandeur. So this kind of strange wound, and I feel it's quite a beautiful. I don't know how to perform that, but it links. So that's how it started. I called the wound, and then the body wise, I got Jack, the other dancer, to be like Saint Sebastian. So I was thinking about how, shooting an arrow. So there's also this sculptural references in the past about saints, how one gets, So I think this is kind of modern sainthood here. And then somehow, for some reason, in that link, I also was possibly working in Makassar, which is in Sulawesi. And if you know about Robert Wilson's book of Illegaligo, it is the story of creation by the fifth gender shamans, which call themselves the Bisu. So they have 5 genders, right? So the cis man, the cis woman, trans man, trans woman, and then they have the non-gendered, non-binary, and they are the shamans. The beginning of the story of creation is about them. So they live in 3 realms: the upper world, the middle world, which is where we are, and the underworld. So it's an interesting link for me and all my research it does to this new area. And he's only 22 years old, right? He's a farmer, he plants rice, and he goes to the university, a bit like VCA. It's an arts, he does dance. And then he's a 22-year-old 21st century person. And I thought, well, what's going to be the future of this person, right? It's quite interesting. So,
and is this Jack, the other dancer that you're with? Or?
No, this is Ancha. So Jack is Australian dancer. So I'm bringing both of them together, this Western and this world. And so the last week I came back and we had 1 week, this collaborative part, to see how we can go further. So this is the next stage. So that part of the project is called Climbing the Rain, or Panjat Hujan, which is because they have no word for impossible. So they have this word of explaining how a kind of impossibility. So you say, I'm climbing the rain. So, it is possible and it's not possible at the same time.
I love that. It just evokes such good imagery as well.
It does.
It is kind of like a futile act, is climbing the rain, but at the same time, maybe you could. I don't know. Like,
you totally can.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why it's beautiful. And so these 2 projects come together. You will have these 2 sides. So I call it like a diptych, like, 2 part of a panel. But then I call it the Wounded Rain, which is the idea of a poem that the director of the International Writers Makassar International Festival, he wrote a poem and he's put these 2 together. And so that would be the 3rd stage. This is what I'm applying for now, to be performed in October. So with these 2 diptychs, we come to 1 work. I don't know how it's going to be. I mean, I got a great musician. I got, and I'm just going to just play and explore. But the theme of intensity, the body, the music is all going to be there. How to work with a young Bisu who doesn't speak very much English is an intercultural challenge, but a wonderful opportunity that they've given me, because maybe I sit in that position. I understand where Ancha comes from, like where I came from in my past, and I felt that you cannot take any normal kind of methods to collaborate with someone like Ancha. You have to just let something emerge and listen and see, So that's a very big unknown, which is kind of trance itself, which requires a faith or a kind of a non-striving certainty.
It seems to be very universal emotions and topics, physicality that you're dealing with, Tony. People only do that when they feel like that they're in a safe space. So how do you create a safe space for people like Ancha, who is Bisu, how do you then make him and Jack feel safe in the same space?
Well, they find it themselves, really. I just try to recognize it. The theater is already a safe space, because theater is when you go in to dwell into these worlds. And then the moment you clap, it's over. So it's a definite ritual, And the trouble is, sometimes theater becomes entertaining area, and so you lack that. I mean, entertainment is good, but when you come to this area of the human psyche, then it needs a certain depth of understanding, right? And so how to create that space? It's like saying, I call it the great square. Like, you can step into this square and you can lose yourself. The moment you step on the
Yeah.
square, you're back to the world. So it gives a kind of strange demarcation, like even not thinking that that there's this two space. So you draw the kind of boundaries around this subconsciously. The safety is always the benevolent kind of approach you have. If you have a bad intention, then it doesn't matter what you do. You know, I suppose what bad for an actor could be like, I want to be famous, I want to get money or something like that. Not that fame and fortune is a bad thing, but it happens to you, right? But if you go out to seek it, it's a different area altogether. Then it has to be very manipulative and stuff. So this is the area of killing that ego side. So you are linked immediately with all humankind, not to a kind of subject to a material methods of living, like then you're rich. I think that wealth is an energetic thing, not a material thing. And so this falls in that area. And I imagine that I keep reminding myself how to go to this safety area. So when you have that in mind, then area of trance is safe. People think that, what if I'm possessed by something I don't want to come into me? If it's a valid question, because then they understand that deep trance is that you lose control altogether, that something can control you. But it is definitely, I mean, in kind of new, I mean, if you're in psychosis, you don't have to do anything, you're already there, you know.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so how to get yourself out of that psychotic state is a whole lot of methodology. I think the methods of theater, the effects of art is powerful in their part when it is in anything. Like sometimes even reading a poetry can change you, right? After reading something, you say, no, I'm never going to be that again. And this transformation things happen. And so art is natural in a sense, not that you have to do art. It just happens. It's a bit like breathing. I think art is necessary. It's part of every culture has that rituals.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask is about what do you think the importance of the rituals are? Because it seems to be something that we keep coming back to is ritual.
Mm.
And how important is that to be part of the practice? Does that help with putting you in a certain state? Does it certainly, as an audience member, I know that the ritual of going to see a performance, you do put yourself in a state so you're more open. And like you said, I
Yeah.
like the clapping is when you actually know that's the end and that's,
Yes.
you're back into reality.
Yeah.
So what rituals do you practice and think that are important to the work that you do, Tony?
Well, as a performer, I have this sense of understanding how much I can empty myself, devoid myself. There's always the concept, the ideas, but what differentiates that is that they give you a doorway into something, but this something is always the same thing. It is always a psychological state, but sometimes for different audience, they need different entrance space. So for the people who do banting and who do the bull trance, they don't need much. Everybody knows it. You go there. But for the foreigner goes there and say, what's that all about? Well, it's the same both ways. You bring that over here and it becomes an exotic thing. So it loses its effect of what it does for its own people. So to me, that is what is important for me to create this way of entering into this, I don't know, this something that's never been there before. They call it like poiesis, right? Something natural, like something that would just happen. The flowing of the water, the falling of the leaves. That's kind of what they mean by something static to getting out of static ecstasy. So we know those blockages. We just want to unblock things. And in life, it's always there. So it's constant flow of blocking, unblocking. And so rituals are important in that sense. Rituals are habits of unblocking, of keeping in tune oneself always to the source. I say the source also hesitant because I don't really know what the source is. But you know what? When you're not, when you're ill, when you're blocked,
And what has this taught you about, what is your practice and working with different styles and looking how different cultures around the world have used their different methods? What has that taught you about mortality?
Yeah, the mortality is, I mean, first it links to humans, right? I mean, and then humankind is very hard. So you go to Makassar, and you see beggars, you see people on the streets asking for money, and and you say, "Well, this is kind of different society I come from in Australia, in Melbourne." I mean, there are still people asking money here, but there are different levels of asking for something, right? And there are limitations to access. So I feel that it's an understanding. What I've learned about death is being human first. Like, we all die. That's one of the truths that doesn't change. And so I do not know what value is. Maybe people think that you can make value of something, but I think value is already there the moment you're born. It is just looking at ways of being that just show you the value, no matter if you're lame or you're sick or you're diseased. It's just different. Well, it's not relative. It is definitely difference. So if you compare, then it's always a problem. But it's not a comparison. We all suffer in certain ways, right? Yeah. It teaches me that perhaps in the long run, how not to fear death. Don't know whether I fear death or not. Perhaps if it's tomorrow, I might think about it differently. But
That's the thing, we don't know, do
we
we?
don't know, right? We can talk about reincarnation. We can talk about the unknown, about images, about ideas, but they're just that. Beyond the mind is something else, right? It's just is yeah. So maybe the wealth of what I'm doing is getting closer to not understanding it, just knowing it. I mean, it's measured by real death that people your parents, your friends, and then other things open up when that happens, right? So many things. And if I want to give an example, you say, the moment my mother died, after that, my memory of her becomes multidimensional. Like she's a child, she's a young woman, but when she's alive, it's just the image of her when she's alive, this mom like that, getting old. Now she can't walk. But after she's gone, it's just so, yeah. And you dream like images of your mother differently. So this is a beautiful realm. This is something that I do not know. It only reveals. And so that's why I keep performing, I suppose, because it's not achieving something. You're just part of something becoming itself, right? So that's the idea of being and becoming, so that we are not just being us because we don't know. We're actually becoming something we never known before, constantly becoming. And I think that is one of the idea of Deleuze and Guattari in the Thousand Plateau, as I like that idea of becoming, you know. So you're always confronting an uncertainty, and then you get used to, you go to bed with uncertainty and like it, like it becomes a comforting area. It's almost that if everything's so certain, you become quite uncomfortable.
I suppose it comes back to that reference that you made before about that potential, that you become more open if you don't have that fear. And if you're always becoming, therefore your perception seems to be more of opportunity and what's out there.
Or whatever tends to be what you fear is something you might start to welcome, say, I don't want that.
Yeah.
And so you kind of like an idea of how to strive to feel, how am I going to feel in this? Quite a different conceptual twist, because we learn so much now in a few decades on how to achieve this, how to let go of that things. But maybe it's not. Maybe it is just failure itself, the dark side of success. It comes together, right? You cannot have one without the other.
And tell me, you mentioned the Torah. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, and perhaps our audience about the people and what their traditions are and what you've seen and
In Makassar,
in Makassar? Yeah.
I've only been there a very short time. I spent more time in Java and different parts, but then it is a culture that seems quite familiar to me. It's not very much different from how I was brought up with my aunties, my grandmother's side, and they all have magics and things like that. So I've been to some buildings where, like a little hut, and there was this elderly woman, not too old elderly, but she goes into a trance, and you have all this incense and food, and I'm not scared of it, but it's quite awesome, awe-inspiring space if you're not afraid. It's like, what is this? This is beautiful. You look at it as a ritual, because there's nothing frightening about it. The only thing that can be frightened to Westerners is, I do not know what this is, what it can do, and brings out negative things. That what if something happens to me, But if you don't think it like that, it's actually quite a beautiful performance. God knows we have crazier performers in the West.
Yes, I'm sure you've seen quite a few during your time, Tony. And can you also explain to the audience just exactly what the ritual of the Torah, what the people do in relation to their loved ones? Some people may be unfamiliar with what that is.
Yeah, I think it's not very different humanly. Everyone there in the sense of respect and all, but what is present at the moment is a different thing. The Bisus were persecuted because they came with a confederalistic society that they were very highly regarded by the kings, but those don't exist anymore. So in the kind of modern society of rational and scientific area, they suffer. So how to find the legitimacy of the Bisu people is quite interesting. I mean, I would like to answer that question nicely in the kind of research area that's, what is the future for Ancha, this Bisu, young Bisu person, and what is he contributing for people like us? He might think that we are the one who needs to be saved,
Yeah.
So, because there's a beauty in that kind of understanding that two differences. And I think, physically, it is a poorer country materially, but they are rich in many other ways. When you think about agriculture, food, they don't starve, right? When you think about, so when they were persecuted by the Muslims, certain kind of more extreme Muslim group, I think this story I read somewhere where there are three groups of how Bisus could react. One is they were in the 70s, I think, they were giving the ultimatum of this repentant movement or something, that if they don't repent, they will be sentenced to death. So they can die, which some of them do because they are so stable in their belief that they go out and die. Or second group, where they can assimilate and embrace Islam and find their positions in Islam. And it's a big group too. So they become imams and have high positions, but they embrace Muslim Islamic culture, but then still have a kind of practice of understanding. So this, I don't know how, but I don't know where I'll go. But the third group is quite interesting. They escape into the jungle, and mythically, nobody could find them. What kind of magic of how to be invisible, and those are more interesting in the kind of connection of us, how to be inconspicuous or how to disappear and how to come back again and reappear. And where are these places? So this is a kind of mystical area of magic. And maybe it's not, maybe it's something very simple. But anyway, you have this kind of, between these three groups, you can see yourself in this. What would I do? The hero and the saint.
Working with all of the different organisations that you have or communities that you have, Tony, in your time, what has it taught you about perhaps, or what are your thoughts about the afterlife and the spiritual realm?
When I think about that question, I think about language. How even within a certain culture, they use different language, like English too. You can see how people answer their questions. And I don't have a specific language for that, I don't think. I know that there are words like reincarnation or life after, and I do not know how to articulate how I understand those words. I think it's something to do with a naturalness. like, so level of being unnatural is bringing back to be the human nature, and like Nietzsche write in his book, Human, All Too Human. And he also wrote like, God is dead. So it's like thinking, like, if you're born somewhere without any of this knowledge in the jungle somewhere, then what is it? It's just there. I don't think there is an idea that your parent baboons will tell you that there's a life after death or anything. You know, when something dies, you react. There's a whole emotional feeling. So it's rich, right? To feel grief. It's rich to feel a sense of love, heartbreak, loss. It is so human when you go through that emotional. I think it taught me about what I can do now, maybe, what is available to me, and how deficient I am from that. It's kind of appreciation, it's kind of celebration, I suppose. If anything, it teaches me is to how to celebrate life, maybe. I don't think I understand life after death, but I definitely think that nothing disappears. I think, sometimes I think because I did experience 5-MeO DMT, which is a kind of a drug you take from the frog, and then you go into this. And then when DMT is released in your body, there's no thought. It's just a different dimension. It is quite amazing. Sometimes I feel that just give me an insight of what is impossible to imagine or to even explain. So maybe there's nothing to fear about that.
There is so many questions I want to ask about what you just said then. The fact that I'm just getting my head around the fact that you've taken the toxin of isn't that the corroboree tree frog or the green tree frog? Or
That is combo. That is different. That is actually it something to do with the bile, and it actually like you vomit the water you drink. No,
right.
this is another one. I don't know which desert it comes from. So you scrape the skin and then you inhale as you burn, and it releases DMT. You can take like the vines. You know how you have mixture of vines, the ayahuasca, and then you might vomit or you might, shit. I took that, but I didn't experience vomiting and things. But I actually went to kind of euphoria. In fact, almost, ejaculation.
Yeah, wow.
Oh, yeah, so it was quite an interesting area because somebody told me to surrender. So what I understood as surrender is that don't fight it. Like when this feeling comes out. So it's something to do with thinking. So you start thinking about it, you feel nauseous and you start vomiting. But the moment you learn how to not to think about it, then it's a kind of surrendering or losing control. And then it happens. It was amazing. But it's quite different from the frog, 5-MeO DMT, which is higher level than DMT, which means something in scientific kind of a meaning, DMT. But yeah, definitely I have tried a few, part of my research.
I was about to say that does fall within the remit of research on trance.
But
and
what you call psychedelics.
Yeah. And look, there is a lot of research being done for medical trials now in relation to the role that will play moving forward in PTSD and those sorts of things that we're actually seeing trials done. And we know that there is, I can't remember the exact statistics, but the limited amount of potential or parts of the brain that we are currently using on our everyday basis. So again, it comes down to that possibility and opportunity of becoming. So, in closing, Tony, because we could definitely have an entire other conversation about where that's taken you, but in relation to your current practice, what have you got in relation to thoughts about when people are actually going through extreme emotions of having someone close to them die? What has your practice and what you've learnt along the way, how has that helped you in expressing those emotions that you feel and sometimes dark sides of grief?
I remember, the first big death was my father's death. I wouldn't say it's dark, but in some ways it was very expected because we knew he was going to die after he goes to hospital. It's just quite a marvel to see what he was going through. Like I remember one day asking him, "Are you afraid?" And he said, "Oh, what have I got to be afraid of?" And then after thinking about it, he said, "Yeah, I am afraid." And then I think, what do you say to him? Because you asked the question. And I said, well, maybe there's nothing to be afraid of, because this is from the book of Living and Dying. The Tibetan says that everybody before you has taken this path, and every after you, including me, will take this path one day. You're just taking the path now. So the most you will be is like before you were born. And we're never afraid of what we were before we were born. So that's the best reasoning consolation you could give, right? And so, yeah, I don't really quite understand this grief people go through, except the imagining of something they're so used to possess or depend on, and how a hole it will create, or I don't understand the kind of traumatic area, that complex that comes with it, or even, yeah, in any levels. But definitely they're all different in the kind of multiplicity of experiences. But seeing that happen to someone does bring out a sense of compassion, doesn't it? A sense of how can somebody go through so much pain? You will feel that compassion, the kind of empathy, and that, I suppose, is a reason itself. So I do not know what. I don't think there's any one clear answer. I think the multiplicity of a lot of things happening is so complex. So there's no judgment out there, or even value that one is a better way than the other. I think I read somewhere that saying the right way to die is when you die, and the best way to die is how you die.
That's very true. One that's quoted quite a bit about death, and that's on the opposite side of things, is I think it was Woody Allen, I think, once said, he doesn't mind when he dies, he just doesn't want to be there when it happens.
Yes. Well, that's nice. That's a kind of dissociation. It's kind of
Yeah, it's quite a bit of
yeah,
disassociation,
yeah.
isn't
Maybe
it? But
that is a trance state, right?
yeah, just of a
Yeah,
different
maybe
kind.
we have talked about how that the body look after you, whether you like it or not. It will put you in a trance state. You don't
Yeah.
need to work on it. Yeah.
I have to say, in talking to you, Tony, what seems to be very apparent is this multiplicity that you keep referring back to,
Mm,
and how there is not just one way
yeah.
or one emotion or one process.
Yes.
And it's not just a static experience, but a sense of becoming
Yeah.
and a process that we're going through. What I really love, and will be one of my strongest takeaways from today, was when you referred to the memory of your mother, and the fact that she went from being a memory of her being that one point in time of where she is now and when she was alive, to now remembering her at all stages of her life. And I think that's a beautiful way to think of someone in such a fluid manner once they have died. And I really appreciate you sharing that perspective, and just how beautiful your work is.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah. Just you mentioned my mother. I just finished this off a little bit, but when she died, it's so much different from when my father died. So there's another experience, because her name was Sayang, which means love. So I did a performance both of their death. It was quite interesting, because that was a very rich moment for an artist. So it's powerful time. So there's a lot of gift from the process of death, from somebody dying as well. So that maybe there's a consolation that when you die, it's also a gift to people, disappearing or losing. There's always more in the essence of when you disappear, you become luminous. It's the same thing, so it's not a singular binary meaning. It's either black or white, but it's together, I think. And maybe that is the learning thing. What my father and my mother is like two different area. One go quickly, and the other one he decided to go slowly, a kind of deterioration, which give a whole different experience for the living, like people in dementia and things like that.
Thank you so much for sharing that insight, Tony. I really appreciated talking to you today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.